This weekend, cool, we still have national parks, but please, please, please be gentle with them during the shutdown. I'm begging you. Let's spend some time on the archaeological treasure that is the early crockery of what is now the United States of America. In the first 100 years or so of the Age of Sail Europeans setting up living quarters on the east coast of North America, one of the most plentiful and durable indicators of how these people ate are in the broken dishes they left behind. But even before that, there are several other layers of pottery that covers North America, and it's doing its part to help us understand the first people who inhabited this space. It not only gives us clues to what they ate, it can also show us what they stored and how they preserved it, what technology they had harnessed, and how they incorporated decoration into their lives. Sure, many of the shapes and flourishes were functional and can be shown to be eminently practical, but things like carvings, incorporation of multiple colors of clay, and realistic and fanciful sculptures of things that exist in the natural world, and some that don't, can also give a very small window into the life and imaginations of the people who hunted, fished, and farmed, and built things here before America was even America. As much as we ooh and ah at the stone monuments of Europe, there are just as many stories here in the ground, waiting to be dug up and discovered. The eastern side of North America is geologically extremely old in Earth surface terms, sharing its age with the also very old surface of Australia around Uluru or Ayers Rock. What this means in terms of pottery is that the rivers and streams, extant and left behind, have built up impressive deposits of clay, making the U.S., anywhere rivers and streams run, or used to, a great place to dig up clay. As a result, in modern, colonial, and pre-colonizer times, America has a rich history of pottery that can tell surprisingly detailed stories about the people who made and used it. So if you'd like to go riffle the pages of history that allows you to look into the daily lives of the people who lived here before, here's a list of places you can find parks that include the pottery of daily life in early America. There's the Whittlesey Village Pottery in the Canal Exploration System in Valley View, Ohio, yet another way the Cuyahoga River Basin is cool. You can also visit pottery in the state of Georgia from the Ocmulgee people who lived on the Macon Plateau, and that's right on the fall line for those in the know. There is the much more famous pottery of the Southwest to be found in cliff dwellings and pueblos in Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. But there's also plenty of pottery to be found in the glades of South Florida and along the shores in Michigan and Wisconsin, as well as the Atlantic shorelines of the Carolinas. Finally, pottery doesn't just tell us what people ate, how they stored their food and such. It also has the haunting and fascinating power to show us traces of the humans who made the pots. Finding the fingerprint of a potter thousands of years old, sitting in the clay, is a connection and a shiver worth seeking. So put in your 2 cents, these places that hold so much of the story of this land in its pots, plates, bowls, and cups. Let the people who need to know that these national parks are worth having and worth visiting. And when you can, go seek the stories that are lurking in the pottery of America. Episode 156, The History of Plates. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, for the first time in a long time, I am going way, way back and looking at the beginning of something, and this time it's plates. Follow along to find out why, before I could jump into the development of fancy food in America, I had to take a detour into why your parents or grandparents have all those plates they want you to inherit, but you were never allowed to eat off of them. For this mystery and some old plate history, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that how cultures have decided to eat in groups and which dishes they prefer to use seems to be all tangled up in each other. Geography, geology, local climate, and landscape all have a say in ways I had never considered until I found myself facing my grandmother's dozens of sets of china. About 10 years later, I am finally sitting down to address the question, why so many plates? During the pandemic, as I am sure you are not all surprised to learn, I started watching a fair bit of cooking content on the social medias. I was learning how to negotiate the post-TV channel age. Sure, there is plenty of pink sauce and sparkle meatballs, strange hot dog cuisine, messy kitchen rage bait, and all manner of confections that require precision measurements of nouveau gastro isolates and the manipulation of temperature both above and below freezing in ways that a pre-thermometer cook could never imagine. But that was not what drew me in. Instead, among other things, I started to get curious about the way people were eating their food. The whole trend of showing a cook consuming a bite of what they had just made and then mumbling some version of yum yum around the bite of food has always seemed kind of odd to me. Sort of the earliest progenitor of the nail tapping technique, maybe. But after moving past that, I couldn't help but start to consider all the different ways people were conveying food to their mouths. Since I was weaned on PBS and grew up on Food Network TV shows, at first we were all eating with forks and maybe the occasional spoon. But as my viewing diet expanded, food moved to the mouth with chopsticks, from leaf wrappers, and get this, in just hands, which were always gathering up food in a tidy, tight bite that was then conveyed to the mouth in a clean, practiced manner. And there was none of this dangling food over the mouth, slurping it up like some Commander Riker nonsense. From there, it was only a matter of time until I started looking under the food at the plates. Back in my younger globe-trotting days, I picked up a few dishes I'm proud of, and the standout being a tea set from my trip to Tashkent in the then USSR, but now in the independent nation of Uzbekistan. It included a large platter, a medium bowl, a teapot, and a set of handleless teacups, sort of egg drop soup or miso soup size, comfortable to hold and sip from. They are covered with a bright orange glaze with a pattern of white stylized cotton bowls and leaping deer. And then there's a mildly flashy thin gold rim. When I was sorting out my grandmother's mountains of china, there was a tea set I still can't believe I let go, but it was among about, 12 full tea sets, and it was just too much at the time. It and all the others had cups with handles, saucers, a teapot, a cream jug, and a sugar bowl. And then I think about all the tea sipping scenes out there. There's spoons, the stirring, the balancing of cups and saucers, and the attempts to access tea cookies and cakes. Consuming tea in that circumstance was as much of a test to be passed rather than a chance to sit and chat and relax. On the other hand, my tea set from Tashkent was much less of a trial. While fancy tea might be drunk with no additions, on other occasions I was invited to stir in honey or even jam into this dark, intense brew. And it was served alongside fresh khub, a flattish yeast bread that's second cousin to naan. And the bread could be torn and used as a wrapper for some hearty pilaf, a rice dish served up on the large platter. And it was placed in the middle of the table for everyone to reach in and take a bite. Now, the first time I tried to eat with my hands this way, I was absolute rubbish at it. There's a size of bread to tear off, there's the correct amount of pilaf to grab up, there's the correct pressure to apply, and there is a deft twist of the wrist required to encompass the rice and the other goodies in this neat little package that can be popped into the mouth between sips of tea. But this experience, eating with my hands and watching how good you could be at it, stuck with me. After all, I learned how to eat with a fork and knife, 2 different ways, the American one and the European one. I even learned how to eat with chopsticks, including the stainless steel Korean ones, which are pretty much the final boss of chopsticks. So I was sure learning to eat with my hands was just as much of a skill with technique as any other method. And it was this fooling around with these ways of eating and then watching people do it with all manner of different foods on social media that got me thinking. Different plates and dish sets are going to be required for different ways of eating food. And then, as with any cultural knowledge base, different rules and etiquettes and developed sophistications will all bloom from that. And the Americans, being all nouveau and rootless and restless, in a mere 250 years or so, had gone from some of the most plate-acquisitive people to people who are pondering the Greek celebratory tradition of plate smashing with new interest. So where does this all start, and why are Americans like this, and why were we like that? Okay, well, I'm a long way from sorting out why we are like this. But let's look at the development of plates, and maybe we can get to why we were like that. That is, plate mad in the first half of the 19th century. The first plates used in group dining, we can all agree, are all gone. Made of leaves and wood, they are beyond recall. But the first plates used for food that have been found and recognized and dated as such were not for individuals. Rather, they were served at the center of a group, and food was dispersed to individuals from there. I mean, yes, all along in all places and times, there are going to be people getting bowls of porridges and stews that they will be spooning up or slurping. And they have been and will be servants and slaves, soldiers and sailors and laborers, stateless people and refugees the world over. But that is largely unchanging. We're here to look at what is changing over time. So let's look at that. For the purposes of my sanity and the realistic amount of time I have to research, write, and record this, we are jumping ahead to about the 14th century. And different ways to disperse foods to individuals from a central plate has developed in lots of interesting ways. In Northern Europe, you are eating stew out of a wooden bowl or from a trencher made out of stale bread. A trencher, think of it as like the stalest, hardest bread bowl ever, but in this case, you're hungry enough to eat most of the bowl after the clam chowder has soaked into it as well. I mean, yes, there was definitely pottery in the 14th century in Northern Europe, but it tended to be for drinking vessels and storage jars. Closer to the Mediterranean, where there was more clay and fewer forests, pottery worked its way into eating vessels more regularly. The drier climate and the fact that there had already been a longer pottery tradition in the area both contributed. As you go south into Africa and further east, where metal mining, alloy creation, and craft works have been going for a few centuries already, metalware appears. And in areas where the nomadic life appears and reappears, metal dishes were awesome. They break far less, and when they develop thin spots, they can be repaired, and when dented or broken beyond repair, the metal itself still has value. In places with verdant, even invasive vegetation, the leaf bowl and plate continued. And I mean, come on, who doesn't want dishes they never have to clean? And look at Americans and their appetite for disposable plates now. And we have hot running water that comes to us. Move out from the equatorial areas and pottery returns in less and more sophisticated incarnations. In East Asian cultures, they had been practicing ceramics for so long at this point that by the 14th century, they were getting so far past perfection that they developed an entire language of perfectly and aesthetically imperfect things. And then just as a flex, they also took wooden dishes out to the other end of fancy and developed lacquerware, an insanely time-consuming confection of wood and vine sap. With access to an almost incomprehensible variety of styles, techniques, and patterns, it's no wonder that an entire art of mixing and matching trays, plates, bowls, saucers, and lids developed. And then the pairing of the correct food with each dish or combination of dishes became an extension of that art. And then placing the food in the dish just so was also an art. So way out at that end, when one has all the dishes and plenty of servants, each small dish arranged and combined becomes its own display. And so then actually eating them either becomes an art or something nobody thinks about, and the food is just gulped down because with all that setup, it's just left you so hungry. But for mere mortals eating along the edges of such refinement, they aren't going to be quite so fussy, but the habit of having a small bowl or plate, which is repeatedly refilled from a common plate, does persist. Look at the family style and banquet setups for East Asian foods. Platters of food are brought out, and the diners keep refilling personal small bowls and plates from a center. I mean, we've all seen those tables with the spinning platter in the center so everyone can get at the dish they want. And this eating from dishes at the center of the table or at the middle of the group is everywhere. The different habit of how you get your food changes as you move around the world. The large plates on the spinning platter or lazy Susan often hold spoons, and if they don't, you flip over your chopsticks in reverse so you don't put your mouth germs into the communal food. But other places doesn't even give you your own plate or utensils. And that's where eating from the common plate with deft and skillful pressure and a wrist twist comes in. It makes a ton of sense if you're on the road all the time as a nomadic society. Do we really need all these plates if I have to pack them up every time? Or if there are plenty of leaves, edible and otherwise, around to serve as plates. I mean, it limits the washing up. And that is a super double plus when you're on the road and you have to walk to your water all the time. As a sometimes backpacker myself, the thought of one pot and one dish to eat from, it's always appealing. I get it. Though as someone with limited eating with my hands experience, I confess to being Team Spork. But let's roll back over to Europe where I'm getting on firmer footing again. As you get into areas where people are more stationary, tied to their farms, and they have large tables and pottery, small personal plates start to pop up. The tables could get too big for everyone to reach everything all the time. And that is when two main things start to happen. Either you get servants to start passing food around and people take things and put it on their personal plates, or you pass your personal plate to the person sitting next to the dish you want and ask them to put something on your plate. Either way, the plates are still smallish, and whatever you say, you needed to be seated for such meals. As the Middle Ages wrap up, and science and the age of the compass and sail get going, and the Portuguese and then the Spanish begin to visit the world and spread the good word of the egg tart, they bring home spices, Chinese porcelain dishes, and ideas. One clear, bright line you can see in European museums is the change in dining ware. Before the age of sail and large-scale commercial exchange with China, pottery in Europe is almost entirely utilitarian. And there was absolutely no porcelain. The understanding of the chemistry of the clay and the correct application of heat was unknown. If you were wealthy and powerful, say royalty, a Venetian doge, or just some jumped-up warlord, and wanted to make sure everyone knew it, at supper time, at banquets, the way you did that was with gold plates. These are featured in dowry lists for princesses. They're mentioned in chronicles that list all the courses of, say, a 7 or 12 or 36 course banquet that royalty would stage in efforts to awe each other. And then the ankle biters and strivers, that is, everyone climbing that greasy pole of status, they might go with bronze and pewter. And that's partly because until those slow boats from China, there were no fancy China porcelain plates. Side note, the mixing of this newfangled tomato and lead-based pewter brought back lead poisoning to the upper classes there for a minute, mirroring its last major visit with enslaved Greek cooks making grape syrup in lead pots for rich Romans. But then the Portuguese set up Macau, and the Dutch set up Java, and the Chinese trading colony for the Spanish was set up in the Philippines, and everything just got rolling. It wasn't just the tea. Starting in the 16th and 17th centuries, the export dishes of China would drastically alter the dining scene of Europe and emerging America. Tea dishes were the start of all of it. The cups, the wine ewers that got used as teapots, but plates were next. Suddenly, if you had money, the thing to do was start getting those China plates, and here that means plates from China. The porcelain ceramic had yet to be named China for all your guests. So they can stop eating off wood dishes or stale slices of bread. I mean, talk about a flex. And then we turn the time wheel to the 18th century, and the wealthiest Americans begin to acquire not just dishes from China, which incidentally would inspire decorative colonial era gardens, see episode 53, they would also go in enthusiastically for the cheaper and more readily available European dupes. That's right. Here's where we start acquiring enough plates and soon matching plates to furnish an entire party. But as with tobacco and sugar and tea and coffee, first you make money importing from the originating country, but the real bucks are to be made by bringing production home, or at least to the colonies. So while porcelain and smooth ceramic production continues in China and somewhat in Japan, it also finds homes in places in England, in Holland, in France, and the Prussian states. Thus, we have the grand pottery cities in places like Derby, Wedgwood, London, Staffordshire, Delft, Sèvres, and Meissen. And these are what start showing up on the first new money tables of Europe, and then the tables of America. And then, with the arrival of these much more affordable plates, or plates with much more appealing or recognizable designs, etiquette begins to require that diners be supplied with more than just one plate, and not just any plate. With the arrival of the new, cheaper, brighter whale oil lamps, now these plates also need to be decorative. For those of us raised in the age of relatively cheap fluorescent lights illuminating our school lunchrooms, incandescent bulbs in the dining room chandeliers, and the trendy LED track lighting of swanky restaurants, it is almost impossible to imagine just how dim and even dark eating at the end of the day used to be. You have to remember it was dark, completely dark out, and if you were indoors, even in a tent, it was darker yet. Your light was from the hearth fire, or from pitch torches and wall sconces, or from clay lamps burning olive or fish oil, or lard or leftover cooking oil. And even a few swanky, pricey beeswax candles casts a dim and yellow light. At this point, the appearance of dinner, much less what you're eating it from, mattered very little because, let's face it, you could barely see it. Which is another reason that the fanciest banquets using gold and golden plates were always held during the day with open windows or out of doors in pavilions, and absolutely not in the winter when it was likely to be dim and stormy with short days. But with whale oil starting to light the world in the beginning of the 19th century, especially for those with money to afford the new fancy plates from strange and foreign parts, decorative plates started to matter. In the first half of the 19th century, America is at a confluence of trade and technology. The maturing of the scientific revolution in Europe, crossed with the emergence of industrialization and larger factories, causes the creation of more colorful matching plates at rates faster than the world has ever seen. They figured out porcelain, more colorful glazes, especially the toxic ones. Hello, lead and cadmium. The increasing urbanization of America, along with its growing acquisitiveness and trade fleets, makes a market out of America likely beyond London's wildest dreams back in the previous century. And the increased light at the supper table made these pretty plates all the more appealing, even if you could only get that one set. Pride in these new dishes would lead to the creation of new furniture and new built-in doodads in house construction. In the same way that the television and then the computer has changed the orientation of many living and working spaces in the late 20th and early 21st century, and the way the move from fireplace to stove changed things at the end of the 18th century, plates worth putting on display is going to change the orientation of home kitchens in the 19th century. Next episode, I will get into how the serving of food at table was affected by the more plates and more decorative plates phenomenon. I'll also talk about how at this point America is at the pass your plate stage, but verging on the food is brought to you by a servant stage, and how that ties into a perceived need for literally dozens of sets of china. Plate FOMO, if you will. But before we get to that, I have a fun thing for you to do. Next time you dive into one of the lush costume dramas of the last decade or so that features any sort of upstairs-downstairs shenanigans, and they're serious about it, you will see that the dishes that each class of people eats from is markedly different. The Gilded Age is by far the best to play this game with, because they have lots of meals and lots of people from different classes. So compare the dishes used by the upstairs family and the downstairs servants. Contrast the gaudiness of the plates used by the new money arrivistes versus the elaborate stuffiness of the old money. You'll notice that there are separate services used for morning tea versus afternoon tea. And don't get me started on how you have to have a different set for coffee. And you'll understand why one of my favorite moments in the entire show is one butler looking at the wine and water glasses used by another butler and saying, "Colored glasses, how festive." Thanks for listening. Now, if you'd like to talk China patterns and whether you know someone who collects the India tree pattern and have noticed it showing up on TV, or you just found out we have like a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon situation out in the world, you can always drop me a line at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com or on my various social media handles, which are all at THOA Food. I love hearing from you and what you have to say in your reviews. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Blue Sky, and Insta as at THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.